The USA doesn't only misread China, it misinterprets and misinforms about China to such a degree that almost their entire population has a wrong view of China. As a result, most of the so-called experts, when making predictions about China, will also be wrong. It's impossible to get predictions right when the foundation of knowledge is completely distorted. The US sees China as a threat, but just like Korea, Vietnam, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, or any one of dozens of countries that the US has invaded, China has never been a threat to anyone in the USA, unless we consider that threat to the US primacy as opposed to a threat to their physical well-being. Now, if we're to accept that China is a perceived but not a real threat from a US perspective, it's important to make people afraid. And the reason for doing this is, as the great Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman documented, to manufacture consent. The US needs threats. It has a military complex that thrives on threats, and politicians know this. So in order to remain strong, there needs to be weaker countries. And there also needs to be a threat from a strong one. It's been the USSR, it's been Japan, of course Russia, it's China's turn now, and maybe Iran in a few years, it will be India. So the US employs a range of tactics to ensure that everybody remains misinformed. It's done through trickery. But to an informed observer, it's very easy to see through. So here's my easy guide to just some of those tactics. There are lies, misinformation, selective modality, lies by omission, and disparagement. Let's talk about them. Lies. Back in the 1970s, when Nixon, Carter, and Reagan were all courting China, there was no threat. All three of these presidents are on the record as accepting Taiwan is part of China. The US still accepts this, as does the UN, that Taiwan is part of China. And yet, if we read many reports from the West, we see words such as Taiwan, which China claims as its own, or self-ruled, or breakaway province. And then we look at the words we know Richard Nixon agreed to because he signed them. They were, quote, "The government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. Taiwan is a province of China which has long been returned to the motherland. The liberation of Taiwan is China's internal affair in which no other country has the right to interfere, and all US forces and military personnel must be withdrawn from Taiwan." Nixon signed that. The US media either assumes people will not take the time to check the historical facts and therefore deliberately misleads the public into assuming China is an aggressor of some sort. Misinformation. A few years ago, US headlines screamed, and I quote, "China guilty of genocide, crimes against humanity against Uyghurs." Now, anyone in America reading that headline would and should be aghast, except that not one word has been proven to any satisfactory level of evidentiary value to be true. How they did it was very clever. Many people were taken in by it. A tribunal was set up and paid for by the US National Endowment for Democracy. It wasn't a legal court. It heard stories, which they described as evidence, but were not, from people who were based in the West. It heard no evidence from anyone in Xinjiang, no religious leaders, no ordinary civilians, no lawyers, academics, doctors, business leaders, or government official in China, let alone the region, Xinjiang, that they were investigating. They failed to acknowledge any information in the public forum that came from the Chinese government, and they offered no opportunity to the Chinese government to provide any. Not one witness was cross-examined. Not one alleged victim of any torture or illegal medical procedure was medically examined. Not one name of a person who was killed in this supposed genocide has been produced. Not one witness was asked for simple verification questions such as, "How did you leave China?" The answer would have been embarrassing. China gave them a passport. They traveled from Xinjiang to another city where there were embassies or consulates to get a visa, and they legally boarded a plane to arrive in a different country. China, the supposedly terrible place described by these so-called witnesses, simply allowed them, even helped them to leave so they could tell their story. It just doesn't add up. Yet every US media outlet carried the story as if it were gospel truth. Selective modality. What China could do is not the same as what China will do. The leadership of China is not the same as what they may be thinking. If the allegations were made against China, if they were all to be believed, China might be committing atrocities. But if the allegations were treated as evidence and then tested in courts to a legally accepted standard, it would be immediately found that they are not. This deliberate placement of words we call modals, might, could, should, must, makes people think something is happening when it isn't. It also provides legal protection for the writer and the publication because they never said something was happening, only that it might be happening. A UN report based on allegations made by people in Washington found that China may have been committing crimes. But when the UN visited and examined the facts, they actually found that China was not, which is something else that has never been reported in US media. This is called lies by omission. Not many Americans are aware that the UN sent a special rapporteur to Xinjiang early this year, and that the rapporteur discovered there were no crimes against humanity. There was no evidence of any genocide, and the only nation guilty of any potential crime was the USA for imposing illegal sanctions which affected the human rights of the Uyghur people they were supposedly trying to protect. When the information doesn't fit Washington's narrative, it's simply left out of the media. And disparagement. Americans think that voting for a president every 4 years is a statement of democracy that should be emulated by all. China has a very different point of view, where democracy from the ground up comes into play at the 2 sessions in Beijing every year. CNN, among others, describes China's most important meetings each year as a rubber stamp parliament, indicating that it has no teeth, it's unable to function, it ought not to be taken seriously. What they don't ever describe is how the delegates and the deputies to those sessions are elected to their position, nor how they work behind the scenes so that all the decisions made have been discussed, debated, challenged, amended, and then presented for a vote. A quick look through the Constitution of the National People's Congress would dispel any concerns, but US media have no interest in pointing out where to find that information. There are, of course, other methods. Misinterpretation, using questions as a headline. Look out for question marks. There's even deliberate mistranslation, but the idea is clear. There are lots of tricks, and unfortunately, they fool a lot of the people a lot of the time. Please don't be fooled. Be like me, critical of everything you read, even when you agree with it. Take a deeper look. Thanks very much for watching this second part of a 2-part series. If you have any questions or any suggestions, please put them into the comment section, and please don't forget to check that subscribe button. I will see you next time. Bye for now.